He almost didn't hire her. That was almost the biggest mistake of his life. The room was full of women who looked exactly like what the job posting had described, which was to say, women who had read the job posting and then dressed themselves into the shape of it. Tailored blazers, blowouts, heels that added 3 inches, and the particular kind of confidence that lives only in the legs and doesn't reach the eyes. They sat in the waiting area of the Ferrano Group's executive floor with their portfolios in their laps and their spines very straight and their expressions arranged into something they probably practiced in the mirror that morning, and every single one of them looked like she already understood the rules of this world, which meant every single one of them had already decided what this world was before she walked into it. Bianca Reyes did not look like any of them, and she knew at the moment she stepped out of the elevator and felt the waiting room do the thing waiting rooms always did when she walked into them. A collective, invisible recalibration, the kind that happened below the level of conscious thought and registered only as a slight shift in the air, a brief tightening of the atmosphere, like a room adjusting to a presence it hadn't expected and hadn't budgeted space for. She was 27 years old and built on a generous scale, with wide hips and soft arms and a face that was pretty in a way that required you to actually look at it rather than glance at it. Dark eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that smiled rarely enough that when it did, it meant something. She was wearing the best blazer she owned, which was navy and pressed and 3 years old, and her portfolio contained 7 years of financial forensic work that had saved 2 companies from bankruptcy and helped a third one successfully prosecute an internal fraud case that had been invisible to everyone else in the room. Nobody in the Ferrano Group's waiting room knew any of that. What they knew, or thought they knew, was what they could see, and what they could see made the calculation fast and unconscious and almost certainly wrong. She sat down, opened her portfolio across her knees, and went over her notes one more time. Not because she needed to, because it was better than watching people not look at her. The Ferrano Group occupied the top 4 floors of a building that the city's financial district organized itself quietly around, the kind of company that didn't need to advertise because the people who needed to know about it already did. It had been built by a man named Enzo Ferrano, who had spent 30 years using money as both a weapon and a shield, and it was now run by his son Luca, who had inherited his father's talent for both and added something his father had never quite had, a patience so precise it registered in a room as its own kind of threat. Luca Ferrano was 38 years old and had never, as far as anyone could document, made a decision he later regretted. He was not warm. He was not unkind. Exactly. But his attention was the kind that had to be earned rather than claimed, and the people who worked for him understood that his respect was the most valuable currency in the building and that the exchange rate was not negotiable. He ran his organization the way certain surgeons run an operating room. Every instrument in its place, every person with a function, no tolerance for performance over substance, and an absolute, almost preternatural ability to identify which of those 2 things he was actually looking at. He had not planned to sit in on the financial analyst interviews himself. His head of operations, Marco, had scheduled them and would have handled them entirely if Luca had not walked past the conference room at the wrong moment and glanced through the glass and seen, for one passing second, a woman in a navy blazer, sitting among the other candidates with her portfolio open across her knees and an expression of complete, focused calm on her face that was so utterly different from the performance of calm on every other face in the room that he stopped walking. He watched her for 30 seconds. She didn't look up. She was reading. Actually reading, not performing the act of reading. Her eyes moved, her brow shifted slightly with something she was processing, and at one point she turned a page and made a small notation in the margin with a pen she'd apparently already had in her hand, which meant she'd come into a waiting room with a pen already uncapped. Luca Ferrano went into the interview room and told Marco he'd be sitting in. Marco, who had worked for him for 11 years, said, "Any particular reason?" "No," Luca said, which meant yes, and Marco knew better than to push it. The interviews before Bianca were efficient and unremarkable. Competent women with good credentials and the practiced confidence of people who had been told they were exceptional often enough to believe it without having recently tested whether it was still true. Luca listened, asked 2 questions each, and felt nothing sharpen in him, which was the thing he was always waiting for, the small, specific sharpening that told him he was sitting across from someone who would actually change the shape of a room. Bianca walked in and sat down and introduced herself, and the sharpening began almost immediately in a way he didn't fully understand yet, because it wasn't her credentials, which were on the summary in front of him, and it wasn't her appearance, which he had registered and set aside the way he set aside all information that wasn't immediately relevant. It was the way she sat down. Not the posture, though her posture was good. It was the completeness of it, the way she settled into the chair as though she had decided it was her chair, and the question of whether it was had been resolved before she arrived. There was no edge-of-the-seat quality, no subtle bracing against the possibility of the room going badly. She was simply there, in the room, occupying it without apology, and something about that specific quality made Luca Ferrano set down his pen and give her the full weight of his attention for the first time that morning. Marco asked the opening questions. Standard, procedural, designed to establish baseline competence. Bianca answered them the way she apparently did everything, directly, without preamble, with the specific economy of someone who had learned a long time ago that the people who most needed to prove themselves talked the most, and the people who were actually good said exactly what needed saying, and then stopped. Then Marco asked about the Veltri case. It was on her CV, a financial fraud case she'd been credited as a consultant on 2 years ago. He asked her to walk them through her role. She walked them through it in 4 minutes. Precise, technical, clear. Not a word wasted. At the end of it, Luca asked one question. The initial audit missed the pattern entirely. 3 other forensic analysts looked at the same data and found nothing. How did you find it? Bianca looked at him, directly, the way she had apparently decided to look at everything, and said, I looked at what wasn't there instead of what was. Everyone else was looking for the money that moved. I looked for the money that should have moved and didn't. Absence is usually louder than presence. You just have to learn how to listen for it. The room was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Marco said, making a note. Bianca picked up her portfolio, said it was a pleasure, and left. In the hallway outside, one of the other candidates, a woman from the second interview slot, still waiting on a callback, watched Bianca walk toward the elevator and said something to the woman beside her, something low and amused that Bianca didn't need to hear to understand. She had been hearing the shape of it her whole life. She pressed the elevator button and waited, and when the doors opened she stepped inside and let them close, and she stood in the mirrored space of it looking at her own reflection and said, quietly, to the woman looking back at her, you did the work. You said the true thing. That's the only thing that was ever in your control. She had done this her whole life too. The small, private recalibration. The gathering of herself back into herself. The call came 48 hours later, not from Marco, but from Luca Ferrano's direct line, which Marco told her later was not something that had happened before in his 11 years. She started on a Monday. The first day was exactly what she had expected and nothing she hadn't prepared for. The executive floor had the particular ecology of a place that had developed its own social order over a long time and was practiced at communicating that order to newcomers without ever saying it directly. She felt it in the way people positioned their bodies when she walked past, the slight adjustment of stance, the glances that lingered a half-second too long. She filed it. She set it aside. She found her desk, which was good and well-placed, and told her, without anyone saying so, that someone had thought about where she should sit, and she opened her laptop and began reading through the company's last 6 quarters of financial records. She was still reading at 7 in the evening when the floor had mostly emptied, and the cleaning staff had started their rounds, and the light through the windows had gone the particular deep blue of a city night settling in. She didn't notice Luca Ferrano standing in the hallway outside the glass partition of her office until she looked up for a glass of water, and then she registered him without flinching, which he also registered. You're still here, he said, from the doorway. I'm still reading, she said. You've been reading for 10 hours. The last 6 quarters, she confirmed. I'm halfway through Q3 of 2 years ago. He came into the office and stood at the edge of her desk in the way he apparently stood everywhere, with the complete, composed stillness of a man who had never felt the need to fill silence with movement. He glanced at her screen. What are you looking for? He said. I don't know yet, she said. I won't know until I find it. That's the point. He looked at her for a moment, and something behind his eyes did the thing she had felt in the interview room. The sharpening, the focusing of attention onto a specific point. Go home, he said. The records will be here tomorrow. I know, she said. I'm not leaving yet. He looked like he might argue, and then didn't, which she suspected was rare. He left without another word, and she went back to reading. She found the first anomaly on day 3. It was not dramatic, the way these things never were when you found them properly rather than accidentally. A pattern in the intercompany transfer records, small, consistent, precise enough to be intentional, and irregular enough to be invisible to anyone who hadn't been specifically looking at the shape of the absence. Money that moved in the right amounts at the right intervals to clear routine compliance checks, but moved between subsidiaries in a sequence that didn't match any legitimate operational logic she could identify. She printed 3 pages of records, made her notations in the margins, walked to Marco's office, and set them on his desk. This needs to go to Luca Ferrano directly, she said. Today. Marco looked at the pages. He looked at her. He picked up the pages and looked at them more carefully. How long have you been looking at this? He said. Since yesterday morning, she said. But it starts 2 years ago. Marco picked up his phone. The meeting happened at 2 in the afternoon in Luca's office, which was large and spare in the way that expensive things are spare, every object chosen, nothing incidental, and Luca sat behind his desk and went through her 3 pages with the same focused stillness he brought to everything, and nobody spoke while he read, which took 8 minutes, and at the end of those 8 minutes he set the pages down and looked at her. You've been here 3 days, he said. 2.5, she said. Walk me through it. She walked him through it. The same economy she'd shown in the interview, but more detailed now, more precise. The full shape of what she'd found laid out without drama, without self-congratulation, with the clean professional confidence of someone presenting work they know is good and don't need anyone to validate. When she finished, Luca was quiet for a long moment. This implicates someone with internal access, he said. Someone who has been here long enough to understand the compliance windows. Yes, she said. You understand what that means for you, in terms of this organization. It means I've been here 3 days, and I've potentially just identified a problem that someone with significant internal standing created and has been protecting for 2 years, she said. I understand that. I'm telling you anyway, because that's the job. Something moved through Luca Ferrano's face, briefly, and with the quality of something that didn't often find its way to the surface. Not quite surprise. Something older than surprise, something that had more to do with recognition than discovery. Yes, he said quietly. It is. She did not know, walking back to her desk that afternoon, that Luca had sat in that chair for 2 minutes after she left, and then picked up the phone and called his head of security. She did not know that the name that had surfaced in her 3 pages was a name connected to a man who had been feeding information to a rival organization for 14 months, and that the financial trail she had found in 2.5 days was the first concrete evidence anyone had been able to locate in all that time. She did not know that 3 analysts before her had been handed the same records and found nothing. She knew none of this. She knew she had done the work. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. The name in the records was Stefano Mira, who was 51 years old and had been with the Ferrano Group for 17 years and sat 3 offices down from Luca on the executive floor and had built, in those 17 years, the particular kind of institutional authority that makes people stop questioning whether you should be questioned. He was polished and certain and well-liked in the way that certain people are well-liked because they have studied likability long enough to reproduce it accurately, and he had spent 14 months running a careful, invisible operation that had diverted a significant amount of the company's financial intelligence to a competing organization, and he had been almost certain that it was invisible. He became aware of Bianca on day 3. Not because of the meeting with Luca, that was conducted with a discretion that kept her name out of it for as long as possible, but because Stefano Mira had spent 17 years building institutional radar, and something in the way Luca's afternoon had shifted registered with him as a change in atmospheric pressure, the kind that precedes a storm if you know how to read it. He asked around. He found out that the new analyst had been in Luca's office for 40 minutes. He found out, eventually, what section of the financial records she had been reviewing. That evening he came to her desk at 6, when the floor had thinned out, and he was all warmth and welcome and the particular brand of benign authority that was designed to make you feel simultaneously flattered and slightly indebted. Bianca, he said, like they were old colleagues. I've been meaning to introduce myself properly. Stefano Mira. I've been with the organization since before this floor existed, he smiled. Settling in all right. Fine. Thank you, she said, not looking up immediately, finishing the line she was reading before she gave him her full attention, which was its own kind of message. I heard you had a meeting with Luca this afternoon. Good sign. This early, he let the pause sit. He's not an easy read, but I've learned over the years, if you ever need guidance on how things work here, who the right people are, how to navigate, I'm always available. The organization can be complicated for someone new. He meant it as a door. An invitation to a particular kind of alliance that would also, incidentally, tell him exactly what she knew and when she'd found it. Bianca looked at him for a moment with the same direct, unhurried attention she brought to everything. That's very kind, she said. I'll keep it in mind. Not yes. Not no. Nothing he could use. He smiled again, tightly this time, and left, and she watched him go and felt something cold and certain settle in her chest, the specific professional instinct that had never, in 7 years, been wrong. That man knows exactly why I was in that meeting. She picked up her phone and sent a message to the only number she had for Luca Ferrano, which was the direct line he had called her from. Stefano Mira just came to my desk. Friendly. Fishing. Thought you should know. The reply came in 45 seconds. Don't go anywhere alone in this building until further notice. She looked at that message for a moment. She replied, understood. Then she picked up her bag and went to the coffee station in the middle of the floor where there were still 4 other people and where anyone could see her, and she made herself a cup of tea she didn't particularly want and thought about the specific texture of trouble she had walked into in 2.5 days and whether she had any regrets about it. She didn't. That was the thing about doing the honest work. It left very little room for regret, because regret required a moment where you could have chosen differently. And Bianca Reyes had never been able to identify a version of herself that saw something wrong and stayed quiet about it. It wasn't bravery. It was just the shape of who she was. The cruelty arrived the following morning, which was a Friday, which meant the executive floor had the particular loose, end-of-week quality that made people slightly less careful about what they said within earshot of who. She heard it from the break room. 2 voices she recognized as belonging to a pair of senior analysts who had been with Stefano Mira's department for years. Not because she had memorized their names yet, but because she had the specific memory for voices that came from years of listening carefully to rooms. Luca actually sat in on her interview. One of them was saying, the deliberate disbelief of someone who wanted to make sure the person they were speaking to understood how absurd this was. She must have said something clever, the other said. It couldn't have been. A pause that did the work a sentence didn't need to finish the presentation. Laughter. The quiet, collegial kind that assumes nobody is listening. Bianca walked out of the break room with her coffee and past the desk where both of them sat, and she walked slowly enough that they both registered her, and the laughter stopped, and she kept walking, and she did not look back, and she did not let the heat she felt in her face climb any higher than her face. She sat at her desk. She opened the records she'd been working through. She kept going. What she didn't see, from her desk, was Luca Ferrano's office, the glass partition that gave him a partial view of the floor. She didn't see him standing at that partition, which he had been doing for approximately 30 seconds before she walked out of the break room. She didn't see what his face did when he watched her walk past those 2 desks without stopping, without flinching, with her coffee and her spine and her complete, total refusal to perform the wound. She was entirely unaware that by the end of that day both of those analysts had been transferred to a different department with a memo that said organizational restructuring and meant something else entirely. Stefano Mira moved faster than Luca had anticipated. The full structure of his operation only became clear over the subsequent 72 hours, as Bianca's initial 3 pages were pulled on by the security team like a thread, and the thing behind it unraveled in the specific, ugly way that long-protected things unravel when someone finally finds the right end. He had not been working alone. There was a second person inside the organization, junior, newer, and apparently terrified of Stefano in the way that people are terrified of authority figures who have something on them, who had been handling the actual transfers. And there was a third person in the building's IT infrastructure who had been managing the audit trail suppression. All of this Bianca found out later. What she knew in real time was that on Friday evening, when she was again the last one on the floor, the lights in the corridor outside her office went out in a sequence that moved from the far end of the building toward her, which was not how the automatic system worked, and she sat very still for 1 second, and then she did not do the thing that most people in a thriller would do, which was stay at her desk and wait to see what happened next. She stood up, picked up her bag, walked out the other side of her office through the connecting corridor that ran behind the executive suites, and kept moving toward the stairwell, texting Luca Ferrano as she walked. Something wrong with the lights. Moving toward the north stairwell. She was 2 floors down when she heard the door above her open. She was 3 floors down when she heard footsteps on the metal stairs, more than one person, moving fast. She pushed through the lobby-level door into the building's main atrium, which was still staffed and lit and full of the ordinary friction of an office building at end of day, and she walked across it to the security desk without running and said to the guard, "I need you to call building security to the north stairwell right now. I think someone is following me." The guard looked at her, looked at whatever he saw in her face, and picked up his radio. What happened in the stairwell became part of a sequence of events that Bianca was deliberately not fully briefed on until 3 days later, when it was over, and the information was delivered to her by Luca himself in his office, where he had asked her to come in on a Sunday, which was apparently something he had also never done before. He told her, concisely and without softening it, that Stefano Mira had arranged for 2 men to intercept her in the stairwell that Friday, that they had been detained by security before reaching the lobby level, that Stefano had been taken into custody an hour later, that the full scope of the operation he had been running was now in the hands of the appropriate parties, and that its exposure had prevented a significant intelligence breach that would have cost the organization considerably more than money. He told her all of this, and then he stopped talking and looked at her across his desk with an expression that was doing something she hadn't seen from him before. Something complicated and unguarded, something that sat in his face like a question he hadn't decided whether to ask out loud. "You walk toward the stairwell," he said. "Not the main elevator bank. The stairwell. The elevator bank is visible from the main corridor," she said. "If someone was coming from that direction, I'd have been standing in the open waiting for the elevator to arrive. The stairwell gave me the option to keep moving." "Most people freeze," he said. "I'm not most people," she said. "Not proud. Just accurate." "No," he said. "You are genuinely not." The silence that followed had a different quality than all the other silences she had sat in with him. Those had been professional silences, the kind generated by 2 people who were both comfortable not filling space. This one was something else. This one was generated by something that had been building. She understood now, since the moment she had sat down in a waiting room and opened her portfolio with an uncapped pen and not looked up. "I owe you an apology," he said, which was apparently also something Luca Ferrano had never said to a direct report before, based on the quality of his discomfort with it. "When your interview ended." I laughed. She looked at him. "Not out loud," he said, "but I did it. Marco had your summary in front of him, and I walked in, and I saw the room, and I made an assumption that had nothing to do with your credentials and everything to do with," he stopped. "Everything to do with the kind of thinking I tell other people not to do." "What made you stay?" she said. "You were reading," he said. "Actually reading. With a pen already in your hand." She thought about that. "That's a very small thing," she said. "The small things are the only ones that tell you anything real," he said. "I've known that my whole life. I forgot it for approximately 45 seconds in a waiting room. It almost cost me the most important hire I've made in 8 years," he paused. "I need you to know that I know that." Bianca was quiet for a moment. The thing she felt was complicated, something warm and something else underneath it, the particular complex texture of being seen accurately after a long time of being seen wrong, which is its own kind of ache before it becomes relief. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "That's not enough," he said, and stood up and came around the desk, and when he stopped in front of her, the careful, precise distance he usually maintained was smaller than usual, and she could see the specific quality of his attention at close range, which was total, like a light source that didn't waver. "I've spent 15 years building an organization on the principle that what a person actually does is the only thing that matters," he said. "I've fired people for forgetting it. I sat in a waiting room 3 weeks ago and forgot it myself. About you." In 45 seconds, he reached out and took her hand with the deliberateness of a man who had thought about the gesture before making it. "I don't want to spend another 3 weeks not saying what that cost me." "What did it cost you?" she said, though she thought she knew. 45 seconds of being wrong about the most extraordinary person who has ever walked into my building, he said, and approximately 3 weeks of trying to work out how to say that without sounding like a man who thinks a compliment covers the debt. It doesn't, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm not stopping there. She looked at him. The full weight of her attention, the thing that had made his mother go quiet, the thing that had made the waiting room shift, the thing that had been sending accurate intelligence about rooms and people and the true shape of things since she was old enough to pay attention to how the world actually worked rather than how it said it did. Then don't, she said. He didn't. 6 months later, the Ferrano Group's financial forensics division had been rebuilt around a methodology that Bianca had designed from scratch, with a team she had assembled herself, and the first quarterly report produced under the new structure had identified 3 additional irregularities across subsidiary companies that had been invisible for years. The division had, in 2 quarters, recovered 11 times its own operating cost in protected assets. The industry journal that covered the space ran a brief item about the Ferrano Group's new forensic approach. They didn't name her. She didn't need them to. She was in her office, which was larger now, with a view. When Luca came in on a Tuesday afternoon and closed the door and sat down across from her, not behind it, and said, "My father wants to meet you." "Your father retired 6 years ago," she said. "He's never asked to meet anyone I work with," Luca said. "In 6 years." She looked at him. He looked at her, with the particular expression he had developed over 6 months of proximity to someone who told him the true thing and then waited for him to catch up to it. Something between affectionate and very slightly outmatched. "He read the quarterly report," Lucas said. "He called me and said," he stopped. Something in his face moved. He said, "Wherever you found her, make sure she knows she can stay." Bianca set her pen down. She thought about the waiting room 3 weeks into a different version of her life. The way the air had shifted when she walked in. The way she had sat down anyway and opened her portfolio and read with the pen already in her hand. Because the work was the work and the room's opinion of her had never been the point and was never going to be. She was a fortress. She was the thing nobody had seen coming. She was the woman who looked at the absence instead of the presence, who listened for what wasn't there, who finished the corner before she looked up, who walked toward the stairwell when the lights went out, who sat in a waiting room full of polished performance and simply, completely, took up her space. "Tell him I know," she said. And she picked up her pen and went back to work. If this story reminded you that the room's opinion has never once been the point, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, has anyone ever underestimated you and lived to regret it?